Good afternoon and welcome to one and all. Thank you everyone for joining with us for yet another interesting webinar on laparoscopic procedures in canine and feline patients by Dr. Shalisha Vitane Corrier. Laparoscopic surgery has benefited for many technical advances over recent years, achieving better results and reducing surgical complications. The wide range of equipment and instruments available allow for the performance of surgical procedures without the large incisions that characterize conventional surgery. Laparoscopic surgery constitutes a growing area of expertise in clinical practice where the main beneficiaries are the patients. In view with the same for regarding updating our knowledge regarding laparoscopic procedures, today's webinar is organized on same by Dr. Shalisha. Dr. Shalisha is a meritorious postgraduate in veterinary surgery and radiology from Gadwasu, Ludhiana. She proved her academic prowess graduating at the top of her batch from Bangalore Veterinary College with a record of 15 university gold medals presented to her by the Honorable Governor of Karnataka. She has proven her accolades in various national university sports and co-curricular literary events. Realizing her childhood ambition as a veterinary surgeon, she is a vibrant member of CGS Hospital Gurgaon, which is located in Gurgaon. She completed a training at European School for Advanced Veterinary Studies at Germany on surgical laparoscopy. Having a keen interest in minimally invasive surgery, she has chosen to implement laparoscopy in routine surgeries at the hospital. She has completed an advanced abdominal laparoscopy course at Center of Excellence for Minimal Access Surgery Training Center from Mumbai. She hopes to be able to excel in this upcoming field to enable pets achieve painless and pain-free surgeries and improve their quality of life. Dr. Shalisha is proud to be a member of ISVS and has actively participated in several annual conferences of ISVS. In view of her expertise and keen interest in minimal invasive surgery, I would request Dr. Shalisha to deliver her today's webinar on laparoscopic procedures in canine and feline patients. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Dr. Divyesh. So a very good evening to all those who are attending this ISVS webinar powered by INTAS. So basically what I would like to convey through this webinar would be rather to stimulate an interest in laparoscopy as compared to conventional surgeries, and even try and help young budding veterinarians take up an interest and pursue laparoscopy as a form of regular surgery as well. So let's begin, and I hope this webinar helps at least some, if not all. Mainly I'll be focusing on the clinical aspect because I'm working at a specialty hospital that focuses only on dogs and cats. So let's start laparoscopic procedures in canines and felines. The advantages of laparoscopy. So laparoscopy, as mentioned, is a minimally invasive technique. It has a shorter recovery rate. There is massive reduction in perioperative pain because the incision size is very minute. We don't need to make a long incision, it's just a stab wound, and stab wounds heal faster. It is very beneficial if you're doing a lot of space for stray dogs and cats. It also reduces scarring, which is very important nowadays. Most of the patients that come to us, the patient owners, they themselves at some point have undergone a laparoscopic surgery, whether it is for a kidney issue or even a simple hysterectomy. It's very surprising that most of them also don't mind paying a bit more if they can get the same quality treatment for their pets. In a laparoscopic surgery, there is a magnified image that you can see. So because of this, there is a better view through a small keyhole incision for different procedures. Greater sampling is also possible if you suspect that there could be tumors of different parts, different organs, or if you'd like to take a sample that is not accessible via basic ultrasound. And of course, it is a rapidly advancing field of veterinary surgery. It is definitely soothing to the eyes. So this is a cat spay that we had done. So you can either do an interrupted suture, or you can just put one mattress suture, or you can leave it as such and use a tissue adhesive. Coming to the basic equipment and instruments, basically a laparoscopic unit needs to be established at your clinic or at your hospital. For that, you would require a rigid endoscope, a light source, a camera system, a recording equipment, an insufflator, basic laparoscopic instruments to first, and once you get the hang of it, you can advance. A cautery system. So this is our laparoscopic tower at CGS Hospital, wherein on the monitor you can see that the spaying is going on. So this is a basic view. Generally, we have all the background lights also dimmed so that you can easily see what's happening. Coming to the light source, so you can procure a light source which needs to be it needs to be compatible with your monitor as well as the other systems that you're using for cautery as well as recording, and an insufflator. So the table is set out basically with a camera, with the camera head, the wires that are required for connection, the insufflation wire, a basic laparoscopic surgical pack, and whatever laparoscopic instruments are required. Coming to the rigid endoscope. So basically for laparoscopy, since it's a form of rigid endoscopy, we utilize certain endoscopes. Now in dogs, we prefer to use either a 5mm telescope or a 10mm telescope, which is the width what I'm mentioning. A 5mm telescope would be ideal for the average Indian dog that weighs approximately 10 to 15 or maybe 20 kgs. If you do want to do a spay or maybe another laparoscopic procedure in a larger dog, you can also opt for a 10mm rigid endoscope. Let's say for a Saint Bernard, that would work fine. For cats, however, we do prefer to use a smaller rigid endoscope, which would be approximately 2.7 millimeters, because the working length also is decreased in this with this rigid endoscope. Now the marking on a rigid endoscope basically has 0 degrees and it has a 30-degree view. A 0-degree view basically focuses straight. So when you introduce the laparoscope, you can see only the vision, the field of vision is directly in front of you. However, as seen in the slide, with a 30-degree view, you can also see what is directly ahead and below. It is also very useful for looking under certain organs in the abdomen. So these are the different rigid endoscopes that we use. 2.7 for cats, preferably. 5 mm for dogs and 10 mm for dogs. Coming to the insufflator. So for laparoscopy, we need to introduce a gas into the abdomen to make it distend. The best gas that you can use is carbon dioxide because it is cheap, it's readily available. It does not support combustion, so it's generally safe. There has been talk about using room air, which can also supplement if you do not have medical grade carbon dioxide. It can be used initially in small setups because of its reduced cost, but carbon dioxide, which is of medical grade, is also easily procurable, so that would be preferable. Now, when you start inflating the abdomen, which is the basic step to start off with your laparoscopy, you need to set a specific flow rate and an intra-abdominal pressure. The abdominal wall can only distend to a certain limit and not more than that. More than that, it will only cause complications. So it's always advisable to start the flow slowly. So whatever carbon dioxide is getting infused into the abdominal space, it goes in slowly and it reaches that threshold also slowly. During this time, since the patient is under general anesthesia, you have to observe the SpO2. In some cases, if by chance the flow rate suddenly increases, it can cause a drastic reduction in your SpO2. If you're a single operating surgeon, from a practical point of view, this is very alarming because your monitors are continuously beeping. You wouldn't know whether to abort the surgery or not. The first thing to do in an emergency situation at that time would be to reduce the flow rate and to reduce the intra-abdominal pressure. That being said, the intra-abdominal pressure that we prefer to use in cats is 2 to maximum 4 mmHg, because our Indian cats are generally smaller than the European and American cats. In literature, it's been mentioned you can go up to 6 or even 8 mm, but it's always preferable to keep it lower. Maybe foreign breeds, you can go up to 6. In dogs, the average Indie for a 20 kilo dog, you can go up to maybe 10 or 12 mmHg. That is the intra-abdominal pressure. So this is an image of ours wherein, using the Veress needle, carbon dioxide insufflation is taking place. This is the first step in your laparoscopic procedure. Now, the problems associated with increased intra-abdominal pressure, one is post-operative pain. Post-operative pain increases significantly due to phrenic nerve irritation. In humans, after a laparoscopic procedure, if the pressure was very high, they could experience shoulder pain. In dogs, however, there is generalized discomfort that we've noticed. Reduced venous return is also another thing which is very important. That's why the SpO2 has to be checked. It can cause a direct pressure on the posterior vena cava, reducing the venous return and thereby the cardiac output. It also reduces lung capacity, and in small breeds, this is quite alarming, because if you do not have intermittent positive pressure ventilation, you will need someone to manually bag the patient to resuscitate it. Since it causes acidosis, it also causes immediate hypoxia and hypercapnia. To prevent all of this, the best way is to start slow and keep the intra-abdominal pressure towards the minimum that you would require for introducing the port, and later, if you do not have a lot of manipulation happening inside, or you do not need to approach certain organs that require movement, then you can even reduce it to the minimum distension required. Coming to the basic laparoscopic instruments, one is a Veress needle, which is used for insufflation, trocars and cannula, which can be either screwed or it can be the smooth type. We prefer to use the screw type because that's safer. It has more controlled insertion. You also have a reducer, a palpation probe, forceps, which are of different types for dissecting, grasping, biopsy, a scissor, and either a spay hook or spinal needles. So the relevance of spinal needles I'll explain later during a procedure. And very, very important would be a surgical pack. Now you would require a basic surgical pack for laparoscopy, but it's always advisable to keep an autoclaved advanced surgical pack in case you need to convert to an emergency laparotomy. In case of an emergency, any sort of bleeding, any sort of suspected reason, if in doubt, it's always better to open up. Coming to hemostasis. Now, since this is a keyhole surgery, the image is magnified. What we also need to understand is that bleeding is also magnified. So what would look like one drop on a normal open laparotomy would look significantly larger in a laparoscopy. So under these sort of conditions, what we need to do is either apply direct pressure if there is any sort of bleeding. You can also use certain gauze swabs, a grasping forceps just to clamp that area till you figure out the electrocautery, or introduce an instrument to basically cauterize the bleeder. Hemostatic gauze can also be used. You can use hemostatic clips, but these are slightly expensive, and sutures. The most commonly used hemostatic measure is electrocautery. With electrocautery, you always need to check the instruments for insulation. avoid hybrid systems and keep the instruments well apart. When we're using cautery, we always prefer to basically use smaller bursts, or rather shorter bursts, rather than prolonged activation. Because what happens is, if I generally, when we were using cautery, I used to use maybe 3 to 5 seconds maximum on a particular tissue, not more than that, because then it gives a lot of eschar. That is one. The second thing is, it also tends to cause a lot of fogging and smoke production, wherein you can't see properly. And if you continue to burn that particular area, that tissue may fall below, causing even more bleeding. It's always beneficial to also use bipolar instruments where appropriate. And if using monopolar, use the cut form to keep the voltage low. Remove eschar regularly to avoid sparking. And do not activate the generator. This is very important because sometimes we tend to get carried away when the cautery wire is connected to our grasping forceps or to the Maryland forceps. At that time, what happens is, if we lose our hand-eye coordination, or if, for example, you want to approach, let's say, an instrument on the table, and accidentally this is pushed forward and you step onto the pedal, you may injure the adjacent tissue and not realize it till much later. Even a small burn on the intestine or on the spleen can cause a lot of pain or trauma, or it can, on the intestine, it can even cause a perforation. Another thing that you need to be very careful about when using cautery is that you don't accidentally burn or cauterize the peritoneum. The peritoneum is very sensitive. It is one of the major, in a laparoscopic surgery, if cautery is done well, the perioperative pain is reduced. But if you keep targeting, or if there is cauterization happening of the peritoneal wall, then is that it can also cause increased pain. So keeping this in mind, what we decided was to switch. So we switched to a laparoscopic vessel sealer and cutter. A laparoscopic vessel sealer and cutter is basically a specialized bipolar device that combines pressure and the bipolar energy from a specialized generator. It forms an effective seal by fusing collagen. After you fuse collagen on the same site, you can choose to cut simultaneously after sealing. This also gives an effective seal up to 7 millimeters in diameter. The only disadvantage is the exorbitant cost. Careful cleaning is required, and it also requires gas sterilization. By that, it would mean etiosterilisation. You can use formalin chambers in a small clinical setup, or you may need to approach a hospital or nearby clinic that does have etiosterilisation for this. In humans, they use a laparoscopic vessel sealer just once, and then these are discarded. But for us, we reuse the same after etiosterilisation, after thorough cleaning of all the organic debris and everything of that sort. And it works for at least, let's say, maybe 10 procedures. For laparoscopy, preoperative patient preparation is very, very important. In this, you have to evacuate the urinary bladder. You may need to catheterize the dog. In case of a cat, since catheterization is difficult or not possible, it's always beneficial to call the cat in maybe an hour or two earlier, so that the cat is kept in a cage with a litter box. 12 hours fasting because of general anesthesia, a bowel cleanse if required. Appropriate shaving is very important, and the owner should be informed. In a regular spay, we do shave both the ventral abdomen and the flanks. The owner should be apprised of the same, and their consent should be taken, because some people find it suddenly alarming. And in comparison to an open procedure, since we're shaving a lot of hair, people are not prepared visually for this. Another point to note would also be to check for an umbilical hernia, because if you're going to approach the same patient for a laparoscopy, you can use the umbilical hernia itself and ask the owners if they want it corrected. If they do, you can use the same for a port placement. However, get an ultrasound done before just to see what is the hernial content. In all standard procedures, we recommend a thorough PAC, which is a pre-anesthetic check, which includes blood work and a compulsory chest X-ray to rule out diaphragmatic hernia. This should not be compromised upon. In strays, if you are doing procedures for stray dogs and cats, because of the unknown history of pregnancy, we would also suggest to get an ultrasound done. Coming to general patient positioning. Patient positioning varies with the procedure and the size of the patient, but however, for general procedures, we have the patient in dorsal recumbency. For access to each ovary, the table can be tilted towards the opposite side so that that particular organ is visible. So these are pictures wherein in figure 1 you can see that the dog is in dorsal recumbency with me standing basically towards the caudal end. So this was if I would want to approach the cranial abdominal organs. And in figure 2, I would be standing to the side of the patient so that I can do a midline port placement and then tilt the table towards me to approach the right ovary and move to the other side and tilt it towards me to approach the left ovary. Now let's discuss a general laparoscopic procedure. In a general laparoscopic procedure, ergonomics is very, very important. By that I mean where you stand, where your monitor is placed, how the patient is placed, and what are the wires that come towards or onto your surgical field. This is important because everything should be placed in such a way that it is easy for you to approach it. There are some procedures which a laparoscopic surgeon can do alone. There are some procedures that require assistance. In procedures that require assistance, you have to coordinate with your assistant to see where he or she stands as well, so that proper port placement is done and you do not need to make multiple stabs, because then it defeats the purpose of a minimally invasive surgery. Ports are generally placed at such an angle so that the instruments triangle down towards the point of interest. They should at least form a 60-degree angle of each other. If you put it too close, they're going to have sword fighting inside. If you put it too far, it's not going to reach your particular organ of interest. The other thing before starting, from a clinical point of view, white balancing and an illumination check. Before even insufflating, I always do this. This is very important. If my illumination source isn't working well, or if my white balancing isn't proper, I may not be able to recognize icterus, I may not be able to recognize bleeding as well. So from a view, this should always be done. Coming to the general laparoscopic procedure, step 1, insufflation. As discussed, we use a Veress needle. Basically, you need to first understand what procedure you are doing. Make a mark with a permanent marker or a temporary sterilized marker onto the skin so that you know where you're going to place the ports. At that particular site, you can inject lignocaine, and generally for normal procedures, we prefer 1 to 2 centimeters cranial to the umbilicus for the first port. This is where the needle will be inserted for basic insufflation. A small nick is made in the skin with either a number 11 or number 15 scalpel blade. This picture clearly illustrates the positioning of the Veress needle, the angle that it needs to form to prevent intra-abdominal trauma. The abdominal wall is basically lifted up with the non-dominant hand, and the Veress needle is introduced at an angle. it's always preferable to introduce, if you're right-handed, it's always preferable to introduce a Veress needle towards the patient's caudal end, so that accidentally you do not injure or penetrate the diaphragm. The Veress needle basically contains a spring-loaded hollow, so once it is into the abdomen, it is inserted properly into the abdomen, you can notice or hear a pop or a click sound, which can also get confirmed by doing a water drop test. The possible hurdles that you could face upon introduction of a Veress needle would be placing the needle subcutaneously or subperitoneally, which would result in subcutaneous emphysema when the carbon dioxide pipe is connected. The second possible hurdle could be placing the needle into the omentum or falciform fat as seen in this picture. This tends to obstruct vision. So when you're introducing the next port, you will not be able to see anything. If this sort of case scenario does occur, what happens is that the intra-abdominal pressure tends to increase. So you may notice that your insufflator is showing alarmingly high intra-abdominal pressure, but that's not so, because the carbon dioxide is actually going into the omentum or the falciform fat. Penetrating a viscus is also possible, however rare. And obviously, if you penetrate the spleen and you inject air, it could result in a fatal air embolism. Now, once the Veress needle has been successfully introduced, we need to connect the carbon dioxide pipe to the Veress needle. And as mentioned earlier, let's start with a slow flow of carbon dioxide. Keep on checking the intra-abdominal pressure. If it suddenly goes high, you may need to reintroduce the Veress needle if you're unsure. If the SpO2 goes down, check if there is another problem. Up to 2/3 of the maximum level of abdominal distension, which would normally suffice, you can introduce the primary port. Now, a primary port is basically introduced 2 to 3 centimeters away from the umbilicus. Your Veress needle is still inside, it is still connected to the carbon dioxide pipe. So that continuous insufflation up till your maximum intra-abdominal pressure, what you have previously set, continues. Use of a ternarium tip cannula is always preferred because the second port will be introduced blindly. Coming to the second step, this is the port placement. Now for this port placement, once you have removed the Veress needle, all right, you can start with the, once you have placed this port, which is the secondary port, you can connect the carbon dioxide pipe directly to this port if there is a filter to connect it. If not, in some of the we have a screw type and there is no filter or no connection for the carbon dioxide pipe. In those cases, you still have to keep the Veress needle in the abdomen so that continuous insufflation is possible. Once done, introduce the rigid endoscope into the abdomen to view the internal structures. Upon insufflation, you can notice that the abdomen is adequately distended. The Veress needle is removed and the second port is now placed under direct visualization. Step 3 is placing the secondary port. As you can see in this image, in the surgeon's hand, you have the secondary port. This port is basically after removing the Veress needle, the skin incision has been increased and the screw type of ternarium port has been introduced. Since the primary port does not have an outlet for the CO2 gas, the CO2 gas pipe is connected to the primary port. The camera is introduced via the secondary port to see if the port has, if the cannula has reached the abdomen successfully. There are two types of cannulas that you can use. One is with a sharp trocar. This is a smooth cannula. To place this sort of cannula, you have to place your finger as the restraint over the abdominal wall. Otherwise, what can happen is with sudden force into the abdomen, the trocar can puncture the underlying organs. Another thing that you can use is a glove stopper. However, we prefer not to use these sort of smooth cannulas with a smaller breeds, and we don't even use it in cats because of accidental trauma. Instead, we prefer to use a Turnamian endotip cannula, which has to be inserted via a screw motion of entry. Since it has a screw motion of entry, it has more control. That being said, the incision site and the incision size is very important. If your incision size is much larger than the size of the cannula, for example, if you're using a 5 millimeter cannula and you make an incision size of, let's say, maybe 7 or 8 millimeters, obviously it would suddenly enter the abdomen and there would not be enough of. This would result in a loose port. This would also result in carbon dioxide leakage, and you'll have repeated problems. If this does occur, not to worry. What you can do is you can just do a purse string suture around that port, okay, so that it tightens it up for the time being, and you can easily introduce the trocar or the cannula that you have chosen. Now, since both the ports are placed, the primary as well as the secondary port, you can successfully connect your carbon dioxide pipe to whichever port you desire. It's always preferable to connect the carbon dioxide pipe to the port in which you are not going to place the camera in. This is because when you do connect the carbon dioxide pipe to such a port, what could happen is that the camera could start fogging up because of the difference in the atmospheric temperature as well as the temperature intra-abdominally. So since we're clear on the clinical aspects of a general laparoscopic procedure, let's start explaining certain common procedures that a laparoscopic surgeon should know. Once you start off with these basic procedures, you improve on your hand-eye coordination, you become confident in port placements, then it's always advisable to practice a little more and then move up and advance. So the first procedure that we will be talking about will be an oophorectomy or an ovariectomy. Generally, even in a conventional procedure for a routine spay, we tend to do an oophorectomy rather than an ovariohysterectomy, provided the uterus is normal, it does not have any generalized lesions, no distension, no visible tumors, or no history of pyometra. So in a young dog that maybe hasn't come to heat or has just undergone 1 or 2 heats, this is the preferred thing. If you are planning on doing an oophorectomy, then you can approach it laparoscopically. The incision size is much smaller and there is relatively lesser pain. With the patient in dorsal recumbency and the patient aseptically prepared for surgery, the ports are now placed as we had previously discussed. In cats, we use 2-3 mm ports. If you're planning on using 2-3 millimeter ports, then a laparoscopic vessel sealer will not be the instrument of choice basically for cauterization, because the minimum size of a laparoscopic vessel sealer is 5 millimeters. Hence, it will not go into this port. If you do have a laparoscopic vessel sealer, you will need to choose a 3 millimeter port and a 5 millimeter port. The 3 millimeter for the camera and 5 millimeter for your vessel sealer. Prior evacuation of the urinary bladder is very important for an oophorectomy, because when you do introduce the camera, it's visible to check the uterus for any distension. And if the urinary bladder is quite full, one is you can't see the uterus very well all the way down. The second thing is that you may accidentally also puncture the urinary bladder when you're introducing a port. So in cats, provide cat litter either in the pre-op or in the inpatient kennel. So this is a picture showing two 3 millimeter ports that we use for cats. And this is a picture showing two 5 millimeter ports, which is used for a dog. Now, introduction of the rigid endoscope into the port. Once you finished your white balancing and your ports have been placed, you introduce the rigid endoscope into the designated port. When you introduce it, your camera head should always be facing cranially towards you, all right, and the light cable should also be grasped simultaneously. Orientation in case of a 0 degree telescope or a 0 degree rigid endoscope is basically always pointing forward. Orientation is very important if you are using a 30 degree scope, because in a 30 degree scope you can see over or you can see under. So it all depends on your orientation. And the orientation is basically if the camera and the light source are all in the same plane. For an oophorectomy, the patient is now rotated towards the left since the surgeon is standing on one side. The surgeon can now locate the right ovary just caudal and lateral to the right kidney. The ovary or the bursa is grasped with the grasping forceps, held up to the abdominal wall. The forceps is now left to rest below and the ovary is transfixed to the abdominal wall. So for transfixing to the abdominal wall, there is a spay hook that you can use. However, the spay hook after some time tends to get blunt. The second thing is it's quite difficult for a single person to coordinate holding the camera, holding the forceps, as well as hooking the ovary. So what we have done as a modification is earlier we used to use a percutaneous suture. Instead of a percutaneous suture, nowadays we just use a spinal needle which is shaped as a hook. Since it is of the cutting type, it goes into the skin very easily. This is the positioning wherein in my left hand I have the laparoscope and in my right hand I have a grasping forceps. Externally, this is what it would look like. And internally, I have grasped the forceps. I have grasped the ovary with the forceps and it's hooked up to the abdominal wall. Left would be for a cat using a 3 mm telescope and right would be using a 5 mm telescope for a dog. Once this is done, percutaneous fixation of the ovary is done to the abdominal wall, which is basically using a spinal needle. So the spinal needles, you can see that they are remodeled as hooks, and using a needle holder you can just push it through and then it's left there. The spinal needle, after you have hooked the ovary, you can just pull it up till its base and just attach an artery forceps onto it so that it doesn't slip. And cautery is now going to be done. The uterine attachments, pedicle and ligament are transected to free the ovary. Once the ovary is free, you always have to inspect for hemorrhage. But when you inspect for hemorrhage, don't pull any of the cauterized area because sometimes that can cause the seal to get disrupted. If that happens, don't panic or don't rush to immediately remove an instrument and reintroduce another. The other very important point is whenever you introduce an instrument into the abdomen, it should always be done under direct visualization. No instrument should just be pushed in wherein your visualized field is somewhere and the instrument is just led to that area. It should be guided under direct visualization because what happens is if you do traumatize something else on the way, you will never know until quite late. So this is clamping for cautery in a cat. I'll just play the video. Hope it does play. Yes, it does. So you can see in the video that using a Maryland forceps, the vasculature is caught and it is clamped. Since we use a laparoscopic vessel sealer and cutter, these are images for the same. You can see the ovary that is being hooked and now it is being dissected from the uterus side in the case of the cat. In the case of the dog, because of the prevalence of a lot of fat around this area, we prefer to first start at the center, ligate the vessels and then move towards the uterine end. Because if you suddenly start from one end, it could result in lopping over of the ovary. So this is a video, basically the next is a video rather, basically showing the ligation, sorry. So in this video, you can see using the laparoscopic vessel sealer, the ovary is dissected. I'll just play that again so that you can see it clearly. There is a lot of fat in a cat, so you have to be quite careful also, especially when using cautery. And then the ovary is grasped. We prefer to locate, cauterize and transect one side ovary, leave it attached to the abdominal wall, the surgeon moves towards the other side, tilt the patient over, repeat the procedure for the other ovary and then remove both the ovaries together. Because what happens is if you transect, you remove one ovary from that port, you may need to enlarge that port size. If you do so, what happens is there's going to be port leakage. Then it will automatically get desufflated. Then you'll have to re-insufflate. So the same procedure, basically you're extending your own surgical time. It's always preferable, since it's hooked there, since we are not using a spay hook, we are using the spinal needle, the ovary that is transected is anyway hooked. So you can approach it later. So this is a short video of a dog oophorectomy. You can notice that the ovary is hooked to the abdominal wall, and then we begin the procedure of transecting. We've started from the center, and then to prevent lopping over to one side, we've moved towards the uterine side. In the video, you may have noticed that at one point there is mild touch to the peritoneum because these cautery instruments are hot. So sometimes their tip is also very hot. So if you're not careful, you may just touch, the hot tip may just touch the peritoneum. We need to avoid it. Moving to the other ovary, the left ovary now is located caudal and lateral to the left kidney. However, when you're approaching the left ovary, what we've normally seen always covers the ovary. And even though the patient is tilted towards you, the spleen sometimes doesn't move over. So you may need to position the patient completely to the right or just tilt it slightly more so that the spleen moves over with gravity. Initially, it may be kind of frustrating to have the spleen there, but I would seriously not recommend poking or moving the spleen with the forceps. The spleen is very fragile and it tends to bleed. For an inexperienced laparoscopic surgeon, you cannot gauge the amount of pressure or the amount of tactile response that you are getting, because these are instruments that are under your control. If you do press an organ or the spleen or the liver with a lot of pressure, you can actually cause injury, even though they are blunt instruments. So this is the picture showing the positioning of the spleen, which is just in front of the ovary. Fogging woes. Now, fogging generally happens if the endoscope is inserted through a port that receives insufflation. So it's always better to switch ports, like you switch your endoscope onto the port which does not have the gas inflow, or otherwise if no other option for that time being, you can just switch off the CO2 gas inflow itself. You can also clear the endoscope head by gently rubbing it against the peritoneum, but avoid rubbing it on an organ, again for the same reason that you could injure. You can also immerse the endoscope head in warm saline water if this keeps happening. After both the ovaries are cauterized and transected, the forceps with the forceps, the ovary of each side is grabbed and desufflation is done. You may need to increase the port incision mildly. In some cases, the ovary, if small, can even come out through the normal cannula itself, what you have placed. And if it is larger, you may need to grab it with an artery forceps once it is out halfway through the muscle, and gently with a twisting motion, manipulate the ovary to come out. The port is then replaced, mildly insufflated, and the next transected ovary, which is hanging at the abdominal wall, can easily be approached and removed. The transected ovaries, which are attached to the abdominal wall, these are free ovaries. So when you go in the second time, you may not get that much of space. That's why direct visualization is very important. Pick it, remove the percutaneous spinal needle, grab it, and you can remove it. This is the ovary retrieved through the 5 mm cannula in a cat. We didn't even need to increase the port size. This is the ovarian size in a cat as compared to the port. So now you can also gauge the amount of magnification that was happening via the rigid endoscope. The port size, however, is increased for removal of an ovary in a dog because we've used the 5 mm port. After a general check for any iatrogenic damage or bleeding, the abdomen is desufflated and the abdomen wall is closed, either using PDS 2030. Since I use maybe 1 or 2 single interrupted sutures. Since we don't yet, we just put a single suture on the skin and place a stay gauze. In some cases, owners prefer that we have a surgical coat placed. In some cases, just a stay gauze with the e-collar also would suffice. And post-operative pain management for 1 to 2 days with antibiotics, depending, for 3 to 5 days can be given. So this is what a completed procedure would look like. In this, I've specifically put 2 different types of sutures because I wanted to focus on either a single interrupted or a single mattress would work. In a dog, this is with cross mattress that has been placed. And this is when the dog had come for a post-op check, just before suture removal. Now coming to the next procedure. Sadly, in many of the conventional spaying methods, if it has been approached via the flank or in some cases even via a ventral midline incision, one side of the ovary has somehow been left. So in these sort of cases, what happens is that maybe many years later, the dog tends to come to heat. In some cases, it can also result in stump pyometra. If stump pyometra hasn't still set in, but the dog tends to come to heat because of a remnant ovary, as in one side ovary hasn't been removed via a conventional method, you can choose a laparoscopic procedure wherein the incision is really small. You just need to move in, approach that particular ovary, transect it and remove it. So this was a case that we had gotten wherein the dog was spayed 5 or 6 years ago at another clinic elsewhere. So what happened was that the owner had noticed that for 4 years she wasn't coming to heat, but in the past year she's noticed a lot of male dog attraction towards this particular bitch. So even though there wasn't any visible sign of bleeding, she thought of getting a basic ultrasound done during the preventive health check. And that's when we noticed that there was a remnant ovary. Since stump pyometra hadn't set in, we had advised that we can approach this laparoscopically. So if you see the previous spaying incision scar, it was quite elaborate. And this is the procedure basically wherein the uterus had been removed earlier and the ovary that has been left has a lot of significant adhesions. So there were adhesions to the kidney and on the side of the ovary, on the side of the uterus as well. So the remnant ovary has been hooked to the abdominal wall as a routine procedure. We also evaluated the other side because sometimes we may just notice something in a laparoscope via laparoscopy rather than what you would notice on an ultrasound. However, no ovarian structure was detected. So we chose to leave transecting or doing any sort of manipulation on that side. This is a short video of the same procedure. The remnant ovary with its adhesions are seen. You can see the hooking that is happening with the spinal needle. It's coming in percutaneous. We're just trying to separate to be sure there is some fat also that has been hooked. Now the laparoscopic vessel sealer comes in. Since there are adhesions, we prefer to start at this center, and since there was slight bleeding during the time of hooking, we chose to cauterize that area first. So it forms an effective seal, and once the seal is formed, on that you can cut as well. This is the other side. The ovary hasn't been seen, the uterus has been completely removed. So the laparoscopic surgical wound in this dog is the same. 2 small ports requiring just a single suture on each of them. The dog was up and about the next day. The owners also were very happy with the fact that even though the previous surgery hadn't gone that well, this one at least did. The next procedure that you can do on a regular basis if you do get a lot of cryptorchid cases. So cryptorchidectomy earlier used to be a little bit of a difficult procedure because what used to happen was you have to make a very wide parapreputial incision to locate the testicle and then excise the same. So you're cutting into a lot of muscle. There's a lot of post-operative care and management that is required. The next thing is you cannot place a proper gauze there since the dog is uncomfortable, then he tends to urinate, the gauze tends to get wet and those sort of things. So laparoscopic retained testicle removal is an excellent procedure that can be sought out. We, however, if we do get a cryptorchid case, we always do an ultrasound to check the size of the intra-abdominal testicle, because in some cases it has gone undetected for even 10 and then it has started showing signs of cancer. So accordingly, just to plan the procedure and to plan our port placement. Now port placement, the standard port has to be placed for the camera. This can be placed either at the umbilicus, slightly cranial, slightly caudal to the umbilicus, but there should be sufficient distance available so that you can access and check both sides of the abdomen. In some cases, there's only a single retained testicle. If you have bilateral retained testicles, you may want to approach both. The secondary port for the approach to the right retained testicle would be a parapreputial port, which after you visualize where the testicle is, then you can plan to place the port. In this particular case, there was also an inguinal hernia. That's why I chose to show this picture, because even though there was an inguinal hernia, we could still approach this testicle laparoscopically. But then for removal, instead of enlarging the port that we had placed to approach the testicle, we chose to remove it via the inguinal hernia. So the same method, the intra-abdominal testicle is first located, then it is hooked onto the abdominal wall using a spinal needle. Resection of the attachments are done using a vessel sealer. So this is the video wherein you can see that we have located the intra-abdominal testicle. Using a laparoscopic forceps, grasping forceps, we've hooked it using the spinal needle, and Yes, using a laparoscopic vessel sealer and cutter, we have sealed the vessels, and since this is a wider vessel, we choose to do double clamping on it and then dissect. Other laparoscopic or assisted procedures that aren't routinely done but can be done later on once you get the hang of a basic procedure. One is a laparoscopic assisted gastropexy. This you can use as a preventive measure against GDV in large breeds of dogs. You can also recommend it if you're getting a spaying done in, let's say, a heavy Labrador or a Saint Bernard. Since you're doing the procedure laparoscopically, you can club another laparoscopic assisted procedure. The patient has to be in the same position, dorsal recumbency. Primary port is similar. The secondary port, however, is 3 centimeters caudal to the last rib on the right side of the patient. Basically, you need to be able to introduce support and introduce a grasping forceps and take the part of the stomach up to that particular part of the wall. The other procedure that you can also do is a lap-assisted cystotomy. If you do get a case of a single cystolith, you can think of this procedure, wherein the incision site would be small. You just need to do the same port placement, a primary port 2 centimeters cranial to the umbilicus, and a secondary port in the case of a male dog would be paraprepucial. Once you have located the urinary bladder, you can just place a port over it. In a female dog, however, you can choose a paraprepucial, but it wouldn't make sense. It's much better to be on the linea alba itself, maybe 4 to 3 or 4 centimeters approximately caudal to the umbilicus after visualization of the urinary bladder. In some cases wherein normal cystoscopy also cannot be done, for example, in the case of a male dog, instead of doing, let's say maybe there is an ultrasound detected growth and you need to take a sample of it, or if you do need to just approach that single solitary growth, instead of making a very wide traditional incision, you can opt for this, get the laparoscopic assisted cystotomy, get the growth resected, and then close it normally. The other laparoscopic assisted procedures that you could think of would be for GI foreign body removal, for a peritoneal foreign body removal, as well as for organ biopsies. Now, organ biopsies would require careful planning and marking because this would be based on the anatomical location. However, the general laparoscopic procedure would remain the same. Only port placement would differ. The scope for the future would entail intracorporeal suturing, cholecystectomy, hernia repairs, tumor removals, adrenalectomies. So once we get our basic laparoscopic procedure set, our hand-eye coordination is in, we are confident that we can do most of the laparoscopic procedures, basic laparoscopic procedures, well and good, we might as well venture. Nobody knows everything, so it's always better that we learn, and then maybe we can even move into the thorax to do thoracic procedures. Thank you. So I'd specifically like to thank the CGS team, the organizers of ISBS, Dr. Divyesh, Dr. Patil, Dr. Tiwari, Dr. Nilesh, and a very, very big thank you to Dr. Nitin Bhatia from Indus for helping me out today with the dry run and everything. Thank you so much. So over to the team. Let's discuss. Thank you.
We would like to thank you on behalf of the entire organizing team to give us, to come over for the platform, to give us a webinar on the eve that we are celebrating the Lady Vet Month, and it was good to have you. I have interacted a number of times with Silisha, and the basic thing what she says is, as you learn, you grow. So for her, learning is a gradual process, and I really appreciate that point of hers all the time. Let me come to the questions. I think questions are much lesser in number because videos were good. It was elaborative. It was itself self-explanatory. Still, we have one question from Dr. Arvind. It says, how can we know the abdominal pressure is sufficient enough? What is the
Okay.
maximum rate of insuffocation?
Okay, so basically to know if the abdominal pressure is sufficient enough, basic distension would be an indicator. That is one. Second thing is when you do connect the carbon dioxide pipe, you will notice that there is from a normal level, it starts insufflating. When it reaches a maximum, the abdomen becomes very hard, very tense, and other anesthetic points that you would notice is that the dog starts breathing very rapidly, or there is sudden shallow breaths, then sudden rapid breaths, and the heart rate could start going up. We don't want to reach that level. So in literature, what is a safe level is basically for cats maybe 2 to 4 millimeters of mercury, and the other in dogs an average 15 to 20 kg body weight. You can safely use up to 10 or 12 mmHg. I hope that clarifies it.
Yeah, sure. The remaining queries are primarily thank you, Dr. Selisha. Very brief and nice, informative. These are views from the people. So we thank you on behalf of the organizing team to be there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And giving us a good insight into laparoscopic procedures in canine and feline patients. I thank all the audience for sparing the time and being there even when festivals are around the country. So thank you all for your entire spare time with us. Thank you.
Thank you.